Musings of a Modern Conservative, Short Essays on Various Political Topics, by Thomas Hamilton. Section 2, Musings on Economics, Essay 10, Taxes. I have a confounding question that has bothered me for some time. Where does all my tax money go? I think one would be hard-pressed to find someone who has not had to ever pay taxes in some form or another. The real question then seems less about will I be taxed, and even less about by what method I would be taxed. Although it would be nice for it to be less rather than more complicated. But rather, why am I taxed, and what exactly is a tax? I don't think, at least in modern times, that with all the rather supposed sophistication, that all but very few ask these questions. Is taxation taken for granted? Is taxation seen as a necessity? If taxes are a necessity, what is a necessary tax, and what is confiscatory? When do taxes end and equalization begin? Is this even acceptable? Should taxation at some point be a reasonable way to create? Does taxation alleviate in some measure the malfeasance of the faker? Does taxation of all, including the faker, make up for the faker's undue removal of one's labor? If not for the aforementioned noble causes of taxation, then what is the purpose of the taxman, as it were? Can taxes by that measure even be noble? Is this what the liberal is trying to accomplish with taxes? A noble reach of justice, to right the wrongs of the greedy? These are all puzzling questions, but as we muse on the subject of taxation, I will not use the word money. Instead, I use the words labor and time, as I think that this is a more fruitful way of describing the nature of the tax. To begin, let us start with the idea of the whole of the economy. This is a baffling concept, even for the most genius of economists. Is a trillion, or even so small as a billion, actually understood, or is it simply a number with more of the meaning of a word than the worth of its salt? In any case, all numbers, large and small, can at least mathematically be drawn down equally by the whole of their zeros. In other words, 10 trillion can simply be called 10, or even 100. I like the hundreds. They seem to clarify numbers. Thus, let us say that the whole of the economy is worth 100 labor and time. What would this economy be made up of, though? This is why I use the terms labor and time, as this question is easily answered. It is made up of all the labor and time of all those within the economy. Then, where does this labor come from, and what does it have to do with time? It would seem that all this labor comes from those that create the near infinite amount of goods and services within the whole economy. If this group, namely those that labor, have in fact created both goods and services, then shouldn't their labor belong to them? If all their labor does not belong to them, then who does it belong to? What are these goods and services used for, then, if not for their own moral self-interest? Though, how does the faker augment this simple view? Can the faker take from the reasonable, the moral, and the just? Is there a reasonable expectation of those who are not fakers to defend in groups against the minority of fakers? How could such a group attack the faker without hurting their fellow man? Isn't it the case that what this entire group seeks to accomplish is to forcibly return stolen labor back to the laborer, if not by force? Then how else to deal with the faker? Can this labor be removed from the whole and then returned to its rightful place, namely the laborer? I find that these questions lead to the thinking of the liberal, and more begrudgingly, the self-hating conservative. Is the intention of removing this labor not worth the conservative's attention, though? Can the conservative even exist in a world where the labor of one is removed? Yet more pressing, should the conservative act upon their natural impulse to exact justice upon the faker? The question is, though, does the conservative seek out justice? Does the conservative seek out equality? Can equality ever be accomplished? Is there some reasonable measure by which inequality can exist? In this case, the issue to the conservative comes to call: is the rule just? Does it equalize? Does it stop the faker? Or does it simply facilitate opportunity? But then, if all these questions are removed, namely those of removing from the faker, then would there be a need for taxes? I pose this question. If men were angels, would the taxman still come? I would think so. The question is, though, why would the taxman come if men were angels? Who would pay to pave the highways? If not for the mutual use of common items, what else would taxes be used for? Wouldn't it be beneficial for us all to contribute? and be in our own reasonable moral self-interest to a common defense. The issue is then how much labor and time must be spent on defense and common use items before it is simple aggrandizement. What then about government stimulation of the economy? Can the government even stimulate the economy at all? Or is the notion a ruse or red herring? If the government can stimulate the economy, by what measure would it be stimulation, and by what measure would that stimulation be over and or under? Even more concerning of a question, though, is when should the government stimulate the economy? If the government can and or should stimulate the economy, what is the form that it should take? In other words, how much labor and time must be used to stimulate the economy? I find that this question works best to explain the notion of stimulation, as it removes the word money. When money is removed from the question, and if all our economy is made up of labor and time, in order to stimulate an economy, wouldn't we have to stimulate labor and time? Then, if the only way to stimulate our economy is through labor and time, how does the government go about spending labor and time to stimulate labor and time? It would seem to me that all the labor and time within an economy is all that we have. If our economy has 100 labor and time on average, 110 labor and time in a good economy, and 90 labor and time in a bad economy, how would the government increase this? In essence, wouldn't the stimulation of the economy come down to a simple remixing of all the current labor and time? The government removes, say, 10 labor and time from one area of the economy, and then gives it to another. How does this stimulate an economy, though? Wouldn't the destimulation of one area of the economy to stimulate another sector of the economy simply create a neutral balance? So removing the labor and time from one set of individuals and giving it to another set of individuals is not stimulating at all. Isn't it simply redistributing the economy's labor and time? Yet, can there be a way to stimulate an economy? In examining the labor and time of an economy, it can be noted that at some point the economy does have more than the average of 100 labor and time. How does this happen, though? And can the government create this? I can only see one way to stimulate an economy, and that is by the creation of new labor and time. Wouldn't a newly created section of the economy that needs labor and time stimulate an economy? If the government were to add labor and time to this in a reasonable amount, this would stimulate the economy, but that labor and time would then have to multiply on its own. This is the trick in my view with stimulation of the economy, by government or by normal economic avenues for that matter. When labor and time are used in an economy, it must, in order to stimulate, grow of its own, without continued additions of labor and time from other areas of the economy. If the labor and time does not grow on its own, wouldn't there simply be a neutral balance of labor and time? In other words, no stimulation at all.